My name is Declan. I'm the Secretary of Out for Independence. With me here we have co-convener Erin, and Michael is also on the call but not a host, but Erin and I should be at the top of your screens, and we're delighted to be joined tonight by Zoë Playdon, who's very kindly agreed to talk to us about her work and her research. She's an extremely accomplished academic who has 2 PhDs, if I'm not wrong, and 5 degrees, including 2 degrees, yeah. Which, you know, who among us can say that? And has recently, last year, published The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes, which is a really fascinating piece of hitherto pretty well hidden trans history that I think is really important, and it's going to be very, very enlightening, but will probably also fill you with righteous anger. So direct it in the right direction afterwards. So we're going to be hearing from her for a while, and then there's going to be a Q&A session. So in terms of housekeeping, for any questions that you'd like put to Zoë, please message those to Erin in the chat function. You can just send those in at any time during the talk or during the Q&A session, and those will be put to Zoë. And just to let all of you know as well that tonight's session is being recorded and it's going to be put on our website afterwards. So if you would like your name or face or whatever kept off, then maybe, you know, take your name off, your screen name off, and hide your camera. And if you don't want your name read out, if you're submitting a question, let Erin know that. And you should all be on mute and not be able to unmute yourselves, but just for, you know, out of Zoom courtesy, I'm sure we all know by now we're 2 years into this nonsense. Keep yourself on mute. And yeah, with that, over to Zoë.
Okay, thank you, Declan. Thank you everyone for inviting me to talk. I'm going to share my screen with you now, and I'm going to tell you a story. The story has 3 parts: Ewan's life up to 1970, trans experience from 1970 to 1996, and trans lives from 1996 to the present day. So each section of the story will take about 15 minutes, and then that should leave plenty of time for questioning. So Ewan's life up to 1970. I first heard about the hidden case of Ewan Forbes in February 1996, when the legal team I worked with lost this judicial review of the right of trans people to correct their birth certificates. And we'd shown in court that trans people used to correct their birth certificates without any difficulty in the past, and argued that they should still be able to do so as a matter of common sense and natural justice. And we didn't understand why we lost. Then, that evening, a man called Terence Walton got in touch. Terence was the lawyer in the famous 1970 legal case, Corbett versus Corbett, involving the late trans actress April Ashley. And he said, everyone always blames me and April for trans people not being able to correct their birth certificates. But, said Terence, it wasn't our fault. Before they went into court, he said, he and April were taken into the judge's chambers and shown another earlier case, told they couldn't refer to it, that everyone involved in it was sworn to secrecy, which now included them, and that all records of it had been removed from the public eye because, and there's a quote, some interests it's more important to protect than the rights of individuals. And he'd say no more than that. When we tried to get him set to say more, he said that he'd already said too much. So in activism, you always try to avoid conspiracy theory. But coming from such an authoritative source, we had to check this out. So I got in touch with Mark Rees there on the left, who founded the lobbying group Press for Change, and Stephen Whittle there on the right, who read it. Some of you might know either Mark or Stephen. And we decided that if such a case did exist, then it had to involve male primogeniture, the archaic law that means some aristocratic titles and estates can only be inherited by a man and never by a woman. Until 2013, the UK monarchy was decided by primogeniture. The law still exists, and it often governs big money and political power, since it can give right to sit in Parliament in the House of Lords and govern. And although the United Nations criticises such some preference systems as entrenched gender equality, which harms whole societies, male primogeniture is still considered by some to be fundamental to our unwritten British Constitution. So we decided to start by eliminating all the aristocratic trans men that we knew about. Mark remembered Ewan Forbes, and Stephen passed me his obituary. It looked as if, sorry, I skipped one. There we are, his obituary. It looked as though Ewan had been intersexed, having a natural biological variation of sex, and as though it would be easy to find his court case and eliminate it. And so began the mystery of the hidden case of Ewan Forbes, because wherever I looked, Ewan wasn't there. I looked for his case in the University of London Law Library, in Scotland's Signet Library, and in the Scottish Records Office. But neither I nor the staff in those locations could find any record or listing for it. I telephoned the Home Office and the Office of the Lord Advocate, the head of law in Scotland, and both asked me to write to them, but when I did, neither of them replied. However, an item in the Glasgow Herald gave me a date for the case. And Dr. Lynn Jones MP, with whom I'd co-founded the Parliamentary Forum on Gender Identity, wrote to the Lord Advocate. The first reply said there were no records of the case. The second said that there were records, but the Lord Advocate didn't feel it appropriate to release them to Dr. Jones. And a third letter repeated that refusal. And, you know, it seemed astonishing that a member of Parliament, the people's elected representative, could be refused access to documents that should have been in the public record. And in the end, it took 2 years and the direct intervention of the Home Secretary for the case papers to be released. 500 pages of verbatim transcript of trial that took place over 4 days in May 1967, together with the judge's decision. The short story is that until the 1960s, trans people self-identified, received affirmative medical care, corrected their birth certificates, and lived in complete equality. After 1970, trans people could no longer correct their birth certificates, had their civil liberties removed, were socially excluded, and subjected to a brutal medical regime that included compulsory sterilisation. The tipping point for this change was the hidden case of Ewan Forbes. So who was Ewan? Well, Ewan was born in 1912, the youngest child of the aristocratic Forbes Semple family. They weren't grand, they weren't dukes or marquises, but they were very distinguished because their titles were among Scotland's oldest, and the family had a history of service to and friendship with the Crown. Ewan's grandfather had been an intimate friend of Queen Victoria, his mother was a close friend of Queen Mary, and his father was aide-de-camp to King George V. They had a 20,000-acre estate with a mansion at Fintry and a castle, Craigobar Castle, on the other side of the estate, 24 miles away. The mansion's gone, but the castle's still one of Scotland's most iconic buildings, and some of you may have visited it. The family moved between mansion and castle every summer, an event called the Flitting. And here you can see Ewan, not quite 7 years old, on his pony, Tommy, in the background there, with his 14-year-old sister Margaret in the foreground, and their mother, Gwendolen, the Lady Semple, between them in the governess car. As Ewan was growing up, it became clear to his mother that although he'd been assigned female at birth, he was definitely a boy. She let him dress and play as he liked at home, and instead of sending him to boarding school where he'd been treated as a girl, she homeschooled him. Gwendolen let Ewan fill his life with all the games that he loved, shooting with his air rifle, lassoing the farm cattle, fishing, taking dogs to go ratting, and so on. Like parents of trans children today, she was watching for this pattern of persistence consistence, and insistence that characterizes and defines gender creative children. Unlike the parents of trans children today, she was anxious that Ewan shouldn't go through the wrong puberty. Well, fortunately, back in the 1920s, there was medical help at hand for those that had the money and influence to access it. In 1886, Richard von Krafft-Ebing had provided the first medical definition of being trans, which he called metamorphosis sexualis without paranoia, and by which he meant an intersex condition. Psychopathia sexualis was hugely influential, going to 12 editions, still available in 1967. And it gave us a typical patient narrative, the patient history that creates diagnostic criteria. But it was written for criminal courts to decide who should and who shouldn't be prosecuted. And what Krafft-Ebing meant by without paranoia was not gay or lesbian. Being gay was a criminal offence. And to gain access to medical care, trans patients were required to declare that they found gay people repugnant, as Lily Alb did in her 1933 Man into Woman. And this conscription into homophobia created tensions in the LGBTI community that still endure in some locations today. In 1919, Magnus Hirschfeld opened his groundbreaking Institute of Sexual Sciences in Berlin, and by the 1920s, synthetic hormones were being produced by a new generation of endocrinologists. Gwendolen took Ewan on a tour of all the medical facilities available, disguised as a European cultural tour. In Austria, Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Paris, Ewan was a guinea pig for early preparations of testosterone. So by the time he was 17, he was growing both chest and facial hair. And here he is at the back there, just before his 21st birthday at the Lonnock Highland Gathering, relaxed, friendly, happy. But he had a price to pay for this remarkable support. Ewan's family was a focus of public attention. His father had a strict code of honour that required public duties to be fulfilled, and Ewan was expected not to rock the boat. Consequently, on some formal occasions, Ewan's parents gave him no choice but to dress and appear in public as a girl, something that now we would think of as appalling abuse. Ewan's imaginative response to what we now regard as incredibly abusive was to form a Scottish country dancing group, the Dancers of Don, and always to dance the male part, so that on most formal occasions, his public appearance was as a man, and here he is in ceremonial dress, dancing the Chartreuse. In February 1934, Ewan's father died, and Ewan's elder brother, William, inherited the family titles, and Ewan followed his ambition to become a doctor. He joined Aberdeen Medical School in 1939, a relatively mature student at 27 years old, but he did well, graduating in 1944 towards the end of World War II. And this is his photo from his medical school yearbook, and here he is in surgery. But instead of becoming a surgeon, Ewan chose to become a family doctor in his local market town of Arford, where his former patients still recall him with great affection, and here he's being friendly and jolly with a patient who just reached 100 years old. And of course, a lot of his patients were hill farmers living in isolated crops, and Ewan's reputation was that he'd get to them no matter what the weather, whether by skis or snowshoes or horseback. Life was sweet for Ewan, and in the 1950s, he fell in love and wanted to marry. Oops, a daisy. Yeah. In 1952, he corrected his birth certificate, as trans people could in those days, and married Patty Mitchell, the daughter of a hill farmer. They lived happily together until December 1965, when tragedy struck. Ewan's brother William died, and the Forbes of Craigavon baronetcy became vacant. It was limited by primogeniture and should have gone directly to Ewan, but a cousin turned up, John, determined to claim the title himself. That's him in the photograph on the right. And cousin John was to prove remorseless. William was buried at the peaceful little church of Lochocoshney with a simple stone memorial. And at the funeral, John made it known to Ewan that he was going to claim the baronetcy. Ewan's first response was to try to appease him. He signed over the 20,000-acre estate and family jewels, paintings, and heirlooms to John in return for John not contesting the title. Now, why did he do that? And what was it that Ewan was scared of? It was these two men. In the US, a group of psychiatrists led by Professor John Money on the right in the spectacles and enthusiastically supported by Richard Green, grinning on the left, were at the forefront of a new pseudo-medicine which was busy putting trans people in the same category of mental illness that already included gay men and lesbians. I knew both John and Richard professionally, and in everyday life they were affable, pleasant people. And I think it's really important to remember that monstrous things aren't done by monsters, but by quite ordinary, perhaps even distinguished people, academics, popular media presenters, respected journalists, who have become ideologically fixated. Their dogmatic beliefs move them outside reason and evidence and into an unchallengeable assertion, a kind of distorting lens which justifies their viewpoint and reassures them of its rightness. And it was Money and Green's bizarre dogma that caused Ewan's dilemma. Well, as a doctor, Ewan was aware of this new pseudo-medical trend and will have known that the first gender identity clinic at the University of California, Los Angeles, was subjecting trans people, gay men and lesbians to conversion practices that included both the direct violence of aversion therapy, ECT, and frontal lobotomy, and the cumulative harm of trans-denying psychotherapy. Now, in 1967, if any questions were raised about Ewan's status, then he could find himself reclassified as a floridly psychotic lesbian, with 2-year prison sentences for him and his wife Patty for entering into a perjured marriage. Ewan would be struck off the medical register in disgrace and both their lives ruined. And it was worth paying any price to avoid that. What Ewan didn't know was that having taken the money, John had decided to continue claiming the baronetcy by asserting that Ewan was and always had been female. On the 15th of May, 1967, Ewan and Patty went to court for a 4-day hearing, which family influence ensured wasn't reported in the press. Absolutely desperate, his back against the wall and determined to protect Patty and his lives, Ewan had created an audacious, impossible defense. But how he did that and the secret letter and sudden death that prompted him to it is too complicated to explain here. You're going to have to read the book. I'm sorry about that. But 3 years later, on the 4th of December, 1968, Ewan won his case and succeeded to the baronetcy. And in so doing, he created a constitutional crisis. For you'll remember that the title was subject to primogeniture, and at that period, so was the crown. If a trans man could gain a primogeniture baronetcy, then a trans man could be king, and this caused a political problem. The focus of constitutional law is to secure succession to the throne. You have to be certain who the next monarch will be for political stability. But now the heir apparent might have an older sibling, assigned female at birth, who is trans and claims the throne instead. Or the heir, assigned male at birth, might themselves be trans and no longer eligible. So something had to be done to solve the problem. As Terence Walton described it, the first part of the solution was to bind everyone to secrecy, remove the case from the public records, and instruct lawyers bringing similar cases and the doctors giving medical evidence in them that they couldn't refer to Ewan's case. The second part of the solution was to place trans people firmly outside the pale of primogeniture. On the same day that Ewan went to court, 15th of May, 1967, the Honourable Arthur Corbett, son and heir of Lord Roe-Allen, filed a petition for divorce from the trans model and actress April Ashley. Although April hadn't corrected her birth certificate, she and Arthur had gone through a ceremony of marriage. Their relationship hadn't worked. April was angry that Arthur hadn't given her the villa in Marbella that he'd promised, and on the advice of her solicitor, Terence Walton, she had sued Arthur for maintenance. Now, Arthur could have just ignored April. There was no legal marriage between them, and she had no claim on him. But instead, he responded with a petition to divorce April on the grounds that she was and always had been male. And although Ewan and April didn't know it, they were linked in a domino effect that was going to damage trans lives worldwide. Meanwhile, John Money and Richard Green had successfully exported their new pseudo-medicine of categorising trans people as mentally ill to the UK. In July 1969, they used the first international symposium on gender identity in London as a takeover of NHS care and to psychopathologise UK trans people. This was the background to April and Arthur's divorce, the case known as Corbett versus Corbett, which solved the primogeniture problem Ewan had unwillingly created. And these are the events that my informant, April solicitor Terence Walton, recounted in 1996. One might conjecture that since Ewan's case was heard under Scots law, its decision could not be used as a precedent for April's case heard under English law. But the judge in April's case, Lord Ormrod, was clear it could have been introduced, for otherwise it would have been no point in him prohibiting Terence Walton from using it, and no reason for Terence's resentment of that prohibition. In the event, Ormrod made no reference to Ewan, or to the medical evidence on which Ewan's case was decided, or to the reasoning in it. Instead, he ignored senior UK medical and scientific evidence to create a sex test of his own, declaring trans people mentally ill and April incapable of marriage. And that decision wasn't overturned until 2001, when an Australian judge exposed his fallacious reasoning, and meanwhile, his decision had become a super precedent, damaging trans lives in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and continental Europe, and outlawing a generation of trans people. So, after Corbett. Although the April Ashley case was only meant to affect trans people's ability to marry, suddenly, and without any debate in Parliament or any new statute, trans people found themselves stripped of their basic civil liberties. They couldn't marry or adopt, they had no employment rights, and if they were unable to pay their car parking fines, they'd be sent to the wrong sex prison, where trans women's rape was routine and yet not classed as rape. Birth certificates could no longer be corrected, and the trans world divided into two. Those with corrected birth certificates, like Ewan, who melted into the general population, and those without. Because the UK has no document of civil identity, birth certificates are used as proxy by officials and employers across the country. Trans people's private medical histories were instantly exposed, and interactions with officialdom became humiliating. Their driving licenses were secretly coded, so the serial number indicated to the police and other officials in the know that they were trans, promoting discrimination. Social security documentation revealed trans people's former name and natal sex, so they were frequently misgendered and dead-named in interviews at job centres. And the Institute of Personnel Management advised employers that instant dismissal of a trans person was legal and would remove any risk of future customers or staff being offended by their existence. A new psychiatrist-led centralised NHS medical regime was put in place at Charing Cross Hospital, an unregulated, abusive system in which patients had to earn their medical care by complying with all and any arbitrary demand of their psychiatrist, putting up with humiliation and belittlement in what was effectively a system of conversion practices. There could be no real therapeutic relationship in such circumstances. Some patients survived through traumatic bonding, so-called Stockholm syndrome, in which the abused person makes strong emotional links to their abuser, while others just found the resilience to endure. Patients might be rejected or have their treatment ended for not having paid employment, for not being obedient enough, or for not looking or behaving in a way which the psychiatrist judged feminine or masculine enough. We don't know what became of them. If you survived all the tests, then you gained access to the essential medications you required, provided you also agreed to be sterilised. Refusal of sterilisation meant you were not serious and brought instant ejection from medical care. Social ostracism was similarly brutal. Trans people learned to expect to lose their friends and their family, to expect expulsion from the congregation of their church, to be barred from membership of their leisure club and banned from the sport they played. They learned to expect to have to sell their house, change their job, move where they were unknown, to never tell anyone about their past, never get in trouble with the police, and never to expect understanding or sympathy. This combination of legal exclusion, medical sterilisation, and social ostracism is what we would identify in any other context as genocide, biological and cultural eradication. History's unspeakably distressing evidence is that from 1970 to 1996, the UK government pursued a genocidal project against a tiny group of its own citizens. We don't know how many survivors there were, for no records were kept. Trans lives were so erased that they were not even a statistic. New trans community groups sprang up to try to make sense of this toxic environment. We can give the name first wave trans activism to the period before Ewan, marked by trans confessional writings such as memoirs by Lily Alp, Christine Jorgensen and Roberta Cowell, and apologia such as Michael Dillon's Self, raising profile and showing how easily trans lives fitted with cis lives. But after Ewan, trans activism shifted emphasis, and the new second wave trans activism was typified by conferences and guides that tried to make sense of a toxic new medico-legal world and to find a way of navigating through it. The first national conference on trans experience was organised in 1974 by community activists, and the Transsexual Action Organisation produced a 9-page survival guide. Survival not only meant evading doctors who would section you into a locked ward, but also avoiding all jobs with medical examinations, compulsory pension schemes, superannuation, life insurance, or where you might have to use changing rooms. Danger was inevitable. Self-isolation was necessary, and social acceptability was nil. Second wave feminism, especially radical feminism and black feminism, provided the closest allies. Radical feminists such as Andrea Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon and Shulamit Firestone defended trans people's lives to live on their own terms, while black feminism introduced the concept that we now call intersectionality, the idea that an individual may be discriminated against for more than one reason and in more than one way. But in 1979, a bizarre splinter group suddenly emerged of what would have become known as trans-exclusionary radical feminists. Drawing on popular science fiction films of the time, such as Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Stepford Wives, they propagated a conspiracy theory that male doctors were creating a race of artificial women to invade and take over women's space. The conspiracy theorists used the same accusation of sexual predation that had been made against gay men in 1885, African Americans in 1915, and Jewish people in 1940. And absurd though it was, it excluded all consideration of trans men, for example. It was a slur that would be used again in the future. Ewan lived in quiet seclusion through all this. The 3-year ordeal of his court case had left him with all the symptoms of post-traumatic stress syndrome: irritability, hypervigilance, lack of trust, intrusion, and social nervousness. Perhaps to ameliorate or come to terms with this, in 1984, now an old man, Ewan wrote a slender memoir in which he made no mention of the trial or the personal circumstances that had given rise to it. He died in September 1991. His body cremated and ashes scattered, and a quiet memorial service held for him at the little church where he'd been an elder. Now, before we leave this dark period of UK trans history, I'd just like to say a bit about the process of cumulative harm and its effect on trans people and society in general. After Corbett, it was open season on trans people. The media cashed in with transploitation horror films such as Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, Dressed to Kill and The Silence of the Lambs, which presented trans people as violently insane murderers, and the popular press maintained an unremitting output of shock horror stories, usually about trans women. Meanwhile, Dr. John Randall, head of Charing Cross Gender Identity Clinic, set out in his book, Sexual Variations, his vision of NHS treatment that would, and I quote, breed out of our inheritance those with psychopathic and adverse genetic propensities, some form of eugenics, in fact, unquote. While pop sociology such as Liz Hodgkinson's Body Shock both patronised and titillated. Taken together, they created a climate in which trans people were mad, bad, and so dangerous to know that they should be ostracised, incarcerated, or banished. For everyone growing up at that period, these representations sent a clear message that to be trans was to be wrong or ridiculous, a message that was especially powerful for children. In education, we say the first thing a school kid learns is how to be a school kid, how to fit in, what must and mustn't be done, what possibilities can be pursued with praise and what with punishment. It's an automatic social habit of fellowship that never leaves us. We can just as well say that the first thing a patient learns in hospital is how to be a patient, where to go, what to wear, when visiting hours are, who can come, when meals are, and so on. And part of the structure of our consciousness is the desire to get on with the rest of the community and to make reasonable concessions to be part of a larger society. And this means the children learn that being trans is undesirable, antisocial, a terrifying thing, through the glimpses they catch of the values of an adult world. What is said, what is not said, what's said in a whisper, what discussions are instantly closed down, what behaviour gains praise and what's disapproved of by parents, relatives, teachers, and every authority figure. So their first impulse is to stifle or hide things about themselves they fear will bring them concern or anger or humiliation or any other emotional distancing from the adult world on which their lives literally depend. For most trans children growing up during this period, self-monitoring and self-censorship became automatic, reinforced by the absence of any positive trans representation and by the active presence of anti-trans statements and images. Each time they noticed again that being trans was a bad thing, their sense of self received another blow. Their self-worth diminished and their efforts to fit into a cis world redoubled. Cumulative harm shaped the lives of many trans people into barely endurable desperation and despair. And in a damaging symmetry, the same principles shape the values and automatic assumptions of cis people. Part of the harm done to them is that they learn to believe that they're an elite and that trans people are to be disdained. Implicitly, cis people learn to fear difference, to shrink from diversity, so that each negative representation of trans people, each absence of positive trans images increases that fear, decreases cis people's potential for openness to the world, narrows their horizons, reduces their capacity for compassion. Cumulative harm shapes the lives of many cis people into apprehension and aggression. It damages everyone. Part 3, 1996 to the present day. Where are we now? Well, some trans people found the resilience to resist this harm, as did some cis people who became active trans allies. In 1991, as Ewan's ashes were being scattered, a trans woman we know only as P took employment with Cornwall County Council. The bullying and subsequent brutal dismissal she was subjected to was to lead to a landmark decision in the European Court of Justice, the first international case anywhere in the world that discrimination against a trans person was outlawed. Like Ewan's, P's verdict took 3 years to reach, but it restored employment rights to trans people in the UK. And because it was a European decision, it could be cited in other international jurisdictions. The case landmarked a third wave of trans activism, focused on legal and administrative change and a willingness for collaboration and discussion supported by the Parliamentary Forum on Gender Identity. Improvements in access to NHS care, equality law, the prison service, educational provision, and media representation of trans people culminated in the Gender Recognition Act 2004. At the same time, the arguments developed for the P case were repurposed to remove the ban on gay men and lesbians serving in the military. But not everyone supported trans equality. In 2000, an Evangelical Alliance policy statement said that trans people were incompatible with God's will as revealed in scripture and in creation, and advocated conversion practices to cure them. In 2008, sociologists coined the term trans-exclusionary radical feminist, TERF, to distinguish a specific ideology from mainstream radical feminism, which is trans-inclusive. And it's unfortunate that in some circles, the acronym TERF has been used as an insult. That's quite inappropriate. But in academia, and especially in sociology, it's used to provide historical continuity of a specific ideology. So rather than fundamentalist creationism, at this point, TERF ideology referred itself to the 1970s conspiracy theory about artificial women replacing real women, and it positioned trans people as predatory and unreal. Most significantly, the rule of primogeniture was removed from the monarchy by the Succession to the Crown Act 2013, and 200 British aristocrats signed a letter in the Daily Telegraph asking for the same abolition of primogeniture from their titles. But between 2013 and 2020, 6 bills to remove primogeniture were entered in Parliament, and they were all killed, one a year, by alt-right parliamentarians. So if there was any doubt whether the issue of primogeniture was hot enough and big enough to trigger 26 years of horrific trans exclusion, it was removed by Parliament's recent inflexible resolve to maintain its anachronistic systemic sex discrimination. The Gender Recognition Act's many exclusions, right to parenthood, inheritance of property, state benefits, competing in sports, marriage in church, include, of course, inheritance of primogeniture title. In 2018, Prime Minister Theresa May pledged GRA reform, a proposal that was met with hostility, expressed as a wave of moral panic from the new anti-trans equality camp. Creationism and conspiracy theory found common ground in polarized, deterministic ideas of sex and gender, the so-called gender-critical feminism or biological feminism, which were not supported by science or evidence or cultural theory. The old slurs of sexual predation were revived, and anti-trans website members began a culture of manufacturing doubt, trolling, and pile-on. They made unevidenced assertions or completely untrue statements and propagated them by repetition and abusive attack on those who disagreed or tried to correct the record. Even respectable media outlets were influenced by this propaganda. On the 16th of October 2018, listeners to Radio 4's Woman's Hour heard a solicitor explain that because use of single-sex space was regulated by the Equality Act, reform of the GRA wouldn't impact on it. They then heard the whole programme discuss at length whether GRA reform would jeopardise single-sex space, even though they'd just been told it wouldn't be affected, it couldn't be affected. Finally, at the end of the broadcast, listeners heard the presenter's surprise when the same solicitor told them again that this was nonsensical fantasy. It was an object lesson in how fake news is propagated and how what Foucault calls the stubborn will to non-knowledge is fundamental to trans hatred and other forms of embedded bigotry. Now, disturbingly, a pattern is emerging of a relationship between white supremacism and transphobia. White supremacist anxiety about replacement theory, mirrored by anti-trans anxiety about trans people as social contagion. Equally disturbingly, last year a legal challenge to British trans children's entitlement to puberty blockers was used as a wedge issue to attack girls and women's reproductive rights, using arguments that South African journalist Mark Gevisser identifies as hatched by right-wing American fundamentalists. The attempt has failed, but a further attack is threatened. Back in 1988, Margaret Thatcher weaponized the HIV/AIDS crisis, then at its height, to pass Section 28, forbidding local authorities to promote homosexuality or teach it in schools as a, quote, pretended family relationship. And today, the same tropes of disease and masquerade are being used against trans men and women, this time with Boris Johnson playing the role of Thatcher. Trans boys are being depicted as infectious, contagious to their friends, and trans girls are being depicted as a blight to biological sex. Both are positioned as uncertain pretenders who will become regretters if they're not protected from themselves by conversion practices such as desistance. Worse still, as adults, these so-called gender pretenders may access affirmative medical care and replace real men and women, where they will, the story goes, inevitably become sexual predators. This is the narrative supported by this government's shelving of the LGBT Action Plan, its tokenization of the plan's promised GRA reform, and its delay in banning conversion practices. LGBT communities are being pushed back to alt-right values from a generation ago. In those days, it was LGBT Alliance that turned the tide. The successful trans case, P versus S and Cornwall County Council, rewrote human rights law internationally and supported the reclamation of gay and lesbian civil liberties, beginning with lifting the ban against them in the military. And it's precisely that alliance that is now under attack by groups such as Get the L Out, which instrumentalized trans people to increase lesbian visibility at the 2018 London Pride March. Although The hidden case of Ewan Forbes has had a generally warm critical reception. It was given a Stonewall Award in the US. It also produced a hostile campaign, which has given a fascinating insight into how anti-trans camps use disinformation, not least because their complaints seem to indicate that they haven't read the book, still less the endnotes evidencing it. Their assertions that Ewan wasn't trans, that his case had never been concealed, that he couldn't have been used by April Ashley, were nonsense, of course, but also seemed like a wistful evocation of a fantasized lost world structured by heteronormative cisgendered elite, a process that in anthropology is sometimes called nostalgic identity formation. It insulates you from reality. Another anti-trans strategy is for writers to open by saying they respect trans people, but, or that some of their best friends are trans, but, echoing colonial discourse with its infantilizing positioning and patronizing violence, explaining why and how autonomy and self-determination should be denied to other cultures. Its condescension and control echoes what cultural anthropology calls neo-primitivism, a sentimental longing for the certainty and ascendancy of natural, which is to say white, European, able-bodied, middle-class, heterosexual, cis people in an obviously varied, fluid world. Similar alt-right attacks are extended to anyone who supports trans equality, or indeed anyone who is sensitive to injustice in any sphere. They position trans allies as emotional and unreliable, of unstable equilibrium, liable to be easily upset by circumstances which their critics shrug off as unfortunate but inevitable. Perfectionist snowflakes who would be better off minding their own business. After all, this approach goes, only trans people are entitled to speak out about trans inequality. Anything else is terribly bad-mannered, if not downright presumptuous. And this denial of compassion and concern, of consideration and comity, is a strategy to fragment and isolate trans communities who are supposed to look after their own interests and fight their own battles, even though there is no trans representation in Parliament, only one representative in the British judiciary and none in religious leadership. All of these trans exclusionary strategies comprise what ethnography calls anti-conquest strategies. Strategies of representation whereby anti-trans actors seek to secure their innocence in the same moment that they assert their hegemony. And we can trace this strategy back as far as history goes, for it's usual for the violent to claim virtue, whether as protecting the innocent from contamination by corrupting influence or defending their own bad faith. It's a strategy which takes no heed of ethics, which prefers unsupported assertion over evidence, and it's directly opposed to social justice. Nowhere is this more evident than in government's delay to a total ban on conversion practices, interventions to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, whether known as reparative therapy, gender critical therapy, or curative ministry. It causes lifelong emotional and psychological damage. It is classified by the United Nations as torture. It is outlawed by the NHS and all UK major professional therapy bodies, and it has been condemned by senior faith leaders across 10 religions in 35 countries. Its processes have included aversion conditioning, electroconvulsive therapy, corrective rape, chemical castration, frontal lobotomy, and exorcism. Nowadays in the UK, its most obvious form is sustained humiliation and verbal abuse, directed at individuals in the guise of counselling, psychotherapy, or prayer. 20% of trans people have been pressured to undergo conversion therapy at some point, either in psychotherapeutic, medical, or faith-based settings. Recently, all conversion practices have been banned totally in Canada and France, but in the UK, although Johnson said categorically that he would ban it, first he delayed, then he opened public consultation as to whether it should be banned, and then he extended the consultation, which now has closed on the 4th of February. And doubtless there will be some other delaying measure, since, as Sean Fay's excellent The Transgender Issue puts it, quote, "We seem to have entered a period of growing populist authoritarianism. which seems determined to entrench sexism, misogyny, and transphobia across the globe. In the UK, trans people continue to be disproportionately represented in every measure of social exclusion, whether homelessness, sex work, or domestic violence. Trans communities are still fighting for the restoration of an equality that was formerly theirs without question. Rights that we take for granted can be removed in an instant, and it's a long, hard journey to regain them. That's the journey that has engaged trans people and their allies for half a century now. Not a request for new trans rights, but an insistent, persistent, consistent demand that the equality removed in 1970 is restored now. Ewan's story reminds us that 100 years ago, a trans child received affirmative medical care, corrected his birth certificate, and lived his life fully and equally in service to his community and church. And it's that inalienable value of equality that is increasingly threatened by UK government today, a threat that must be resisted, I suggest, by all those who love human freedom and social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. Sorry about that. It just took me a second to get my screen back on. Thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A. I've had a few questions DM'd to me. If anyone else has any questions that they would like to ask, just message them to me and I will be reading them out just to save us the faff of unmuting people and to preserve some anonymity for people who don't want to be on the recording. So my first question, just as I open the chat here, is from someone who wants to remain anonymous. And they ask, Ewan Forbes lived over a long period of changes for LGBT rights with cycles of advancements and regressions. Are there parallels between the different stages of Ewan's life and today?
I think the thing that's worth bearing in mind is the recentness of all of this. You know, we think, or at least in the book, I tried to give us some kind of sense of period by talking about, you know, a second wave of trans activism from 1970 onwards, and then a third wave after 1996 and so on. But in fact, the same people were living all the way through. And so in terms of what is it like for Ewan's life in comparison with ours, well, you know, there isn't really a comparison. I think the comparison that we can find is after his court case, when he'd suffered extreme trauma. And I would suggest that for anyone who's trans born after 1950, say, they will have found themselves going through those kinds of trauma. They might have tipped up in, if you were born in 1950, you didn't become an adult until 1971 when you were 21. At that point, if people started to look for some kind of support or medical intervention, then they would have walked it straight into, you know, well, what I've called transgenocide. So Ewan's life was so different to trans lives today.
Thank you. We have another question that we understand from the book that Ewan was an SNP member, which is somewhat ironic given our activists' take on the aristocracy.
Right.
Do you have any examples or more information about his contributions to the party or involvement in?
No, I just know that in 1975, he was president of the Harford branch of the SNP in Aberdeenshire, but he went completely radio silent. Everything that he had was destroyed. I mean, we have virtually nothing of his life apart from his memoirs and the court case. We don't have letters, we don't have diaries, we don't have those kinds of records. And I mean, I could have, but didn't spend time kind of going through SNP archives for the Harford district in the 1970s. But you know, it'd be great if somebody would. Partly what I've tried to write is a structure and a basis for much more historical research, because there isn't much. Most of what's said about trans lives historically has been formed by cis views, whether it's cis medical views or cis legal views. So there's very little, it's very difficult to get to an authentic trans voice. And trans writing of the time tends to be either confessional, built on a before and after the agony and the ecstasy model, or apologia, please understand us, pushed into this kind of model of supplication. And what I'm really looking forward to for the future is a whole different kind of literature coming from kind of the youth of today, who don't feel that they have to be supplicants and apologetic for themselves. And I would really like to see stuff that's written that reflects back the shame onto the transphobes themselves.
Thank you. I have another question from another person who'd like to remain anonymous, that asks, if Twitter is to be believed, Scotland has become a hotbed of gender critical thought with a number of high profile individuals involved. Does Zoe believe that this discussion is merely taking place within a Twitter bubble, or is it a true reflection of Scottish society?
What shocked me, I mean, it's both, really. I mean, the Twitter bubble is also a reflection of our society. A lot of it is a Twitter bubble. In the Twitter bubble, any old kind of nonsense is said by people who, as I say, are really, they absolutely should know better. And what then happens, so for me, the experience was, I get a note from a friend saying, have you seen the Twitter feed? Which I haven't, because the wrong generation, really, but I did. And there was this great long denunciation of the book and a demand that it should be withdrawn. And Scott's lawyers, who absolutely should know better, saying the case was never hidden and it could never have been used in England, and so on and so forth. And that then, so I just answered those questions as politely, until they became a bit abusive. And I just said, well, we're not going to agree on this. So, we've had the discussion and that's fine, isn't it? And closed it down. They then got in touch with the Times. The Times got in touch with me and said, we're going to write an article about how your book should be withdrawn, etc. And they gave me an hour to respond to 4 long questions. They printed 1 line of that. Then the fight went on. The same people, I guess, got in touch with the Times Literary Supplement. And there was an astonishing letter in there, so florid that it was just like a parody of itself. And again, the TLS published my reply to the first letter, but not to the second. So what happens is the Twitter feed, if it's insistent enough, it starts to shape things like the Times. And the Times is really a bit of a worry, because we're talking about a newspaper of record. It is the authoritative record that, researchers and academics go to. So we see the one strongly influencing the other, and all of it overlaying actual fact. The thing that shocked most people who read the book or who I've talked to about it is when I say, until the 1960s, trans people self-identified, got affirmative medical care, corrected their birth certificates and lived equally. Everyone, I didn't know that. Are you sure? And I'm like, well, yeah. Of course I'm sure. And that fundamental truth has just been so lost, It's just got overlain by all sorts of nonsense, rubbish about Marks and Spencer's not allowing trans women into their changing rooms, which is completely invented. The very, very strange episode of Woman's Hour, spending a whole hour talking about something which they'd just been told online, on air, was untrue. So yeah, it's a very, very toxic and very different environment out there for trans communities at the moment.
Thank you. You've brought up sort of the concept of trans genocide after sort of 1970, but also the change to pseudo medicine, and I'm indulging myself here a little bit as the host to be able to ask my own questions, because I'm actually a medical historian myself. But so you brought up both of those themes, and for me, one of the most moving and striking things when I was reading the book, and this didn't come up as much in your talk, was about Ewan's experience in Germany, both at Hirschfeld's clinic and then receiving counseling in, I believe it was Munich that he received counseling in. And just that affirming experience for him, and how Germany and Central Europe were the center of this sort of new endocrinology, and how that was obviously wiped out in Germany by the Nazis, and then through invasion of all of Central Europe as well. And to what extent do you think that was pivotal in allowing the sort of pseudo medicine to take over, having this actual center of medicine destroyed by the Nazis, essentially?
Oh yeah, I mean, very much so. Ewan never says that he visited Hirschfeld's clinic, but he was in Germany. It would have been most odd if he didn't. At that point, endocrinology was growing up in different laboratories in different places, and researchers would be in touch with each other. But at that point, there was no centralized service except for Hirschfeld's clinic. And we can think of Hirschfeld's clinic as being the first GIC, really, except that it gave transaffirmative care. And its destruction is, very shocking. And certainly it paved the way for psychiatry to do its takeover. And there were a couple of other things too. The people who've been working with trans people, because there was no centralized service, and so there wasn't an organized response really from endocrinology. Harry Benjamin in the US was elderly. He was in his 70s. He didn't want to fight. The same was true of Harold Gillies over here, and Lennox Broster over here. They were both retiring and elderly, and they just didn't want the battle. And psychiatry really was able to take over because it had organized itself. It had got its GIC at UCLA. That had been replicated in New York, and ultimately at MIT and in Toronto and so on. Richard Green had spent a year over here on an exchange thing as an intern with John Randall, and he and John were really close friends. Well, were they close friends? I was at dinner with Richard when he found out that John Randall was a closeted cross-dresser, and he was absolutely shocked. He had no idea. And I think it struck Richard that in any other medical specialty, that would have been absolutely John Randall's own business. But in this context, obviously, the guy was projecting his fantasies onto his patients. The takeover was a takeover. I mean, there were all sorts of odd bits and pieces that we shall, frustrating for a historian never to know the answer. We shall never know why Dewhurst, Professor Sir Jack Dewhurst, who appeared in court on Ewan's side, appeared against April Ashley. What we do know is that the proceedings of Ashley's trial was so harrowing to him that he never treated trans people thereafter. And we also know that actually, because Jack Dewhurst was one of the board of the Erickson Educational Foundation, the US organization that was founded by trans man Erickson to support research into trans medicine. Dewhurst was a board member of that. And so when Erickson offered to fund an appeal for April Ashley, which would be hugely expensive, of course, it was disallowed because of Dewhurst's involvement with the foundation. So these odd little things, people who suddenly appear and seem to be like a stone in a river that diverts it in a certain direction, and then they just kind of disappear again. So yeah, just so dark. The worst, okay, here's the darkest story. This is what Richard Green told me. I don't know. You know, he told it me as a true story, but you have to judge. Richard was part of the American Psychiatric Association and on their board, and he was one of the people responsible for writing standards of care and getting transsexualism into the Index Medicus and into the DSM. He was a very busy little bee. And Richard said that after the meeting, where there'd been generally a vote to remove homosexuality from the DSM, the Register of Mental Illnesses, he said, in the bar afterwards, everyone was saying, oh, well, it's all very well, but some of us have got, you know, bills to pay, kids to put through college. And Richard said, somebody else said, well, listen, why don't we put transsexualism in there? It'll fill a gap. And everyone went, high five, let's do it. That was Richard's story of how trans people became systemically psychopathologized.
Oh, that is harrowing. Thank you.
Dark, isn't it? Very, very dark. Even to think of it as being a possibility is very dark.
Yeah. I have another question from the audience that asks just some clarification about the legal situation, that Scots law doesn't work on precedent, and how might a legal decision therefore in Scotland affect one in English jurisdiction?
Well, it's a jolly good question, isn't it? I mean, first of all, the first thing I can say, and that we just have to say, is, well, clearly the judge in Corbett versus Corbett believed it could. Otherwise, you know, he wouldn't have banned its use. There'd be no reason for him to ban April from introducing it, or for her solicitor, Terence Walton, to be angry about it. But secondly, I asked Stephen Whittle exactly this question. For those of you who don't know Stephen, he's Professor of Law at Manchester Metropolitan University, long time trans activist, survived all the way through the dark 70s, etc. Period, and a very sharp guy. And he said, what nonsense. He said, you can bring precedents in from wherever you like. He said, internationally and all over the place. You know, he said, and obviously you would, and it's up to the court and the judge whether or not they act on them or the weight that they give to them. But of course you're going to introduce them. A precedent, he said, is just an example of a decision being made before, of an earlier decision. So, you know, in spite of everyone saying, oh, but it's Scots law and couldn't be used in English law, that's not what the lawyers themselves appear to believe. And certainly, if it had been my case, then I'd have absolutely insisted on it being referred to, even if you did it with a disclaimer. You know, it may be worth noting that even though it isn't a legally binding precedent, nevertheless, this is not the first time this issue has been decided in a court of law. Yeah, you would at the very least use it as persuasive. And certainly, Ewan's case could have been used in the European courts. We got it just in time for Christina Sheffield and Rachel Horsham to use it a bit in their case at the European Court of Human Rights, but not enough time for the thing to be analysed. There was no time to go all the way through it. We had enough time to get Louis Huren, who's Professor of Transsexualism at the Free University in Amsterdam, to confirm that the medical evidence in it was definitely demonstrated that Ewan was trans, but not enough to do that business that I did in the book of tracing back to see how this came about and then tracing forward to see what the effects were. So there was no time for proper analysis, but it was hiding Ewan's case. Yes, the fact that Ewan inherited the title was made public. The case papers were not accessible anywhere. They were removed from public view, just as Terence said. It had a profound effect on trans rights worldwide.
Thank you. I have one more question, which is following the recent intervention from Baroness Faulkner, do you believe that the Equality and Human Rights Commission is reformable so as to be capable of protecting the rights of individuals as we would expect it to do?
It's a sad business, isn't it? Back in 1993, when we were working on P versus S and Cornwall County Council, it was called the Equal Opportunities Commission. They funded the case. Without the EOC support of trans affirmative legal action to gain equality, that case would never have been, it wouldn't have been possible to bring it. It would have been too expensive. And so again, it's the same regression. Now the EHRC doesn't seem to be going forward. It seems to be going backwards. In the same way that, you know, trans rights haven't gone forward, they've very, very definitely gone backwards. Of course, both of them are reformable. Of course, both of them can become progressive rather than regressive, but there has to be a will and a desire to do that. And it's the will and the desire for trans equality that seemed absent in the current administration.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions from the audience. So unless someone messages me in the next couple of minutes, I think we'll wrap up here. Do you have any, there's a question that an interviewer that I like always asks her interviewees at the very end, which is there something you wish we had asked you?
Let's see. I wish you'd asked me, would you like us as a group to bring this issue directly before Nicola Sturgeon, buy her a copy of the book, ask her to read it, and then discuss it with trans community leaders? If you asked me that question, the answer would be, yes, I would love you to give Nicola a copy of the book, ask her to read it and discuss it with trans community leaders. That would be great. And I also think it would be really great publicity for the SNP.
I think that's a brilliant idea. That should be an OFI project. Thank you so much, Zoe. This has been incredible. Again, I absolutely loved the book, and if any of you are here and haven't read it yet, please do read it because it is incredible. Declan, would you like to say anything before we wrap up?
No, I think it's well, we'll buy Nicola a copy of the book. I promise you we'll do that. Whether or not she's a very voracious reader, she may well read it. She might already have it, actually. We did invite her to this event, but I'm scheduling.
If she already has it and she'd like me to sign it, I will come to Scotland to do so. Another photo opportunity.
Excellent. And if you do come up, let us know.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I think that is us for the evening. Thank you so much to everyone who came, and thank you to Zoe. And hopefully we will all be able to sort of take what we've learned tonight and from the book and move forward with our activism. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Bye.